Today's episode of the Counselling Tutor Podcast is sponsored by Web Healer. You're a counsellor in private practice and you need a website, or you've got an existing website which you need help with. Web Healer are offering Counselling Tutor Podcast listeners, that's you, £100 off the cost of a website design and build. Now, Web Healers specialise in websites for counsellors and psychotherapists. It's what they do. And the Web Healer team provide a completely non-technical, done-for-you solution, leaving you to focus your time on your clients. Operating for 20 years, Web Healer are a trusted resource amongst counsellors when it comes to getting your practice online. So get the package details and claim your £100 off coupon for your new website by going to counsellingtutor.com/website. That's counsellingtutor.com/website.
Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for students of counselling and psychotherapy. Here are your hosts, Rory Lees-Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hi, I'm Rory, and with me, as always, is Ken. How are you doing, Ken?
Exceptionally well, so grateful to be here. Thank you for asking, Rory. And Rory and I hope that you are well too. You've joined us for the Counselling Tutor Podcast. It is episode 258, and we've got 3 topics that we're going to be discussing today, starting with that theory and practice, where we take a little bit of theory and we look at how does that present itself and come alive in the practice of being a counsellor or a psychotherapist. And today, we're going to be speaking about a theory on psychological contact. We're then moving on to practice today, where we look at something contemporary, something that comes up in our day-to-day running of a practice that people might be talking about from our Facebook group. And today, touch in therapy is what we're going to be speaking about. And then into Practice Matters, which is the CPD section of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. And we have one of our seasoned lecturers, Sally-Anne Armitage, who is going to be speaking about managing risk, a really, really important topic. So lots to look forward to in episode 258. But starting us off, Rory, with that theory and practice and that psychological contact. What is it?
I think it's very interesting, psychological contact, and I think it's an essential ingredient for therapy to be effective. And of course, it was Carl Rogers who highlighted psychological contact as a condition within those 6 necessary and sufficient conditions for therapeutic change in 1957. They were published in the Journal of Consulting Psychology, and he outlined 6 conditions that, if they were present, would probably facilitate and show a good outcome for therapy. There would be some psychological and emotional change. And the first one of those conditions was psychological contact. And I think this is really interesting because it's often taught, I think anybody who's listening to this who's doing maybe, their diploma or degrees or their master's degrees, and they've seen Rogers' work, would probably be familiar with psychological contact. But actually, what is it? What is psychological contact? It's easy to just use the word. And I think, interestingly, there are different forms of psychological contact. And I think the first one is that the client understands where they are and what they've come for. And this is particularly pertinent to those therapists who may be working with people with Alzheimer's, or memory loss, or maybe people who are unwell. They may have mental health issue, which makes them unwell. Or, and this is sometimes really missed, I think, language.
Yeah.
It may be that somebody turns up to therapy and they don't speak your language, in which case you cannot facilitate psychological contact, Ken.
Yeah. I like how you've described it. And for me, psychological contact is, do they get it? Do they know why they are here and what process they're entering into? And one of the things we learn when we start our counselling training is that you can't be sent for counseling. You need to feel within yourself, this is something that I want to look at. This is something that I want to work at. And now is the time, and I'm going to go and I'm going to speak to somebody about this. That person is ready for psychological contact. They're there because they want to be there and they understand what the process is. If somebody is sent and they're sat there going, well, I don't really want to be here, that you're not going to have that psychological contact. There's a blockade, there's a barrier between you and that person. So there's that integration of both of you within the process of why you are here. And you mentioned some of the things that might impair or impede that psychological contact. And I'd like to add to that, use of certain medications can impede psychological contact. And of course, use of alcohol or recreational drug usage may lead to impaired psychological contact, where the person is not 100% there. They're not their full selves, and they're not there to be integrated within the session. And the theory that you kind of mentioned of Carl Rogers suggests that psychological contact is one of those conditions that is necessary. It has to be there. Without the psychological contact, we're not going to have that therapeutic process for that client. So we need to, I guess, look out for, do we have psychological contact? Is that person there willingly and wanting to be there to work on what they're bringing? Are they impaired in any way from any kind of drug or alcohol usage? I think that's what we're looking out for.
Yes, and I think there's one other that is sometimes completely missed, Ken, absolutely completely missed, and that is cultural awareness. I think that we're living in a modern age now where we live in a multicultural society. And unless you have cultural awareness, and that can be around race and culture, it can be around sexuality, gender and culture, you can miss the client. We sometimes speak in therapy about missing the clients, and that doesn't mean that you kind of miss them in that, they're not there, so you think, I wonder what they're doing. It means you miss connecting with them. And I think that nowadays a modern therapist should make great strides towards cultural competencies, to understand the different cultures and languages within those cultures, to be able to meet the client where they're at and to facilitate psychological contact.
100%. And I used to think that psychological contact was something we needed to look out for in that first session. But psychological contact can be diminished or broken at any stage within the arc of counseling. And I'll give you an example of that. You've just spoken about culture and kind of an understanding of diversity. When we misstep, or if we misstep, in such a way that person all of a sudden feels judged or not understood, or you don't get me, you're not the right person for me, that psychological contact can be withdrawn from them. They can, this is not the right person for me. And I'll give you an example of that. I am neurodivergent. I'm diagnosed as autistic. If I was in in fact, this has happened. If I was working with any kind of professional who mentioned to me, well, I guess everybody's autistic and on the spectrum at some level, I would switch off to that person because they don't get me. They obviously don't understand who I am and what I'm presenting with. And I would kind of withdraw that psychological contact. I'm not going any further with this. And once you made that decision, that's that psychological contact, that willingness to go into therapy and work and engage together. Once that is taken away, that trust is broken. It can be tricky to win it back.
Absolutely, Ken. And I think that's a point where you need to pause and have an honest conversation with the client and stay where you are and try and rebuild the therapeutic. Sometimes it's called a rupture in therapy, and to build the therapeutic relationship back, to ask that question. And I think there's one other hidden area that can damage psychological contact, and this is probably only pertinent to the UK, I have to say, and that's class. We still have quite a class-ridden society, and I know from my own experience of training that I can remember working with someone who was beyond lovely, when we were working together. She really was lovely. But when I spoke about my experiences as a working class man, her eyebrows started to rise and they nearly went through the ceiling. I mean, clearly they didn't go through the ceiling, but the expression was that of, I really don't understand what this is about. And the conversation slipped a little bit into more patronizing than dialogue.
Yeah.
And I still come across this today. Maybe it's my accent. I don't know, but I've had occasion to speak with people where they have been quite patronizing about the fact that I'm a northern man. I come from the north of England, which this might be completely strange to anybody listening outside the UK, but it is a UK phenomenon. We are a kind of class-ridden society. It has got better, I have to say, over the years, but there's still that little nuance of it. So I guess we have to understand our class and where we're from, and to try and make sense of that within the relationship. So much more, I think, Ken, than when Rogers identified that condition in 1957. We've grown and developed, and we ask more questions.
I think you hit the nail on the head in identifying it as needing to be there for therapy to take place. But it's interesting how we've kind of grown that area, and it's another example that I can think of is maybe I'm just going to use an example of a female presenting for therapy and then being given a male counselor, and maybe they didn't want a male counselor. Maybe there's parts of their journey that they can't share or don't feel comfortable to share with a male counselor. They find themselves there going in because they want that therapy, and then finding themselves with somebody that is not a fit for them. And again, would they fully engage? Would they be fully psychologically present and open to be able to share their story? Maybe not. And I guess we need to check in. It's about asking those questions. I guess step one is being aware of what psychological contact is, what can diminish psychological contact, and then checking in. Are you okay? And I know that you do this, Rory, when you're meeting with a female client. You might say, I'm just mindful that I'm a male counselor, and I wonder how you feel with that. And if they're okay, that's great. It's the choice. Yeah. But of course, they may then say, you know what, actually, there's some of the stuff I want to bring. I would prefer speaking to a female therapist, and then a referral might be made in that case.
Yes, and that could go across the whole spectrum of gender and race and culture. I think in an ideal world, I think if we lived in an ideal world, we could do that. I think the reality is that probably not as easy to do as we would like, because of the constraints of services and therapists on offer. But I think at the very least, therapists can develop that self-awareness and that cultural competence and around whatever culture they're working with, whatever their client's culture is. And I think I'd like to make one final observation. Roger's final tenure at a university, which was Wisconsin, he had a terrible time. He actually said that it was the worst experience of his professional career. And he was working on something called the Psych Project, his words, where he was working with people with psychosis. And I was reading with interest a passage from David Cohen's book, Carl Rogers, A Critical Biography. And he said that he really struggled. The people he took to use person-centered therapy with people who were very, very unwell didn't work at all. And there's a quote in the book which I think is a little cruel. He said, Rogers always said the facts are always friendly. And in this case, they weren't very friendly at all. And I think I'd like to kind of bracket that by saying that, we're talking about the 1950s in America, 1960s in America. There's no reason why people can't work with people with statement in mental health conditions, as long as they're in psychological contact. We moved a long way from there. But it just goes to prove that even Rogers came unstuck with his own conditions. If anything, it proved the point. It proved him right.
It's such an important topic. It's so worth thinking about it, reflecting on psychological contact within your own practice, thinking about your clients and what that looks like. And it is, important enough that you've made a handout for it, Rory. It's a super duper Rory handout. It's free, and you can get that by going to counsellingtutor.com. Click on the podcast tab and make your way to episode 258. That's today's episode. Right there on that page, you can download Rory's super duper handout on psychological contact. Really good if you're a student and if you're writing about it, because it's got a lot of what psychological contact is. Really handy if you're qualified and in practice, just to reflect and relook at that as part of a little bit of CPD. And it brings us to a close on our Theory in Practice for today. Theory to Practice is proudly sponsored by CounsellingSkillsAcademy.com. I'm Ken Kelly, and I've got a real burning passion for counselling skills. I've built training that takes the doubt out of using counselling skills. You get to see the counselling skills used in real live sessions by a qualified therapist. Full sessions, real material, real counselling skills. To find out more, go to CounsellingSkillsAcademy.com. And as we move on from that theory and practice, we find ourselves at practice today, looking at what is contemporary, what's going on right now in the world of counselling. And of course, a topic that comes up so often that really is worth chatting about is the topic of touch, Rory.
Yes, it's a touchy issue.
Ha!
Ooh, it is a touchy issue, and it's one that used to come up a lot in our training groups. Ken and myself taught. And I think it's useful to kind of take a slightly kind of academic look at touch as we move through this part. Now, there are theories that actually use touch, and I'm thinking about bodywork models, adjustment models, trauma discharge model, process model. These are specific models of therapy that use touch as part of the therapeutic engagement. But the key thing here is they're contracted. So the client would know there's touch. They would understand what was happening, and as a consequence, it wouldn't be unusual. And of course, that touch is, appropriate touch. It's negotiated touch, and there'd be a constant dialogue. Certainly for things like trauma discharge models, where there's lots of hands-on work. But it does beg the question for those of us who are in practice not using those models, not contracted for touch, how do we work when we use touch? Do we use touch? What is the position on touch? And, through the years, I've worked in a lot of different settings, as have you, Ken. And there are a few observations that I can make. First of all, I worked as a school counsellor for 7 years, and under no circumstances should you touch young people. I mean, there's no circumstances you should touch young people unless you're doing CPR or something. But you shouldn't touch young people at all. The reason for that, of course, is that they are young people, and also that if you're working in any kind of organisation, be it a school or working, in a youth service, they would have very, very clear codes of practice on touch, and it can be misinterpreted. And I've got to be honest, Ken. There were some times when I was working with young people where, just touching someone's hand may have made so much difference, but you can't do it. You can't do it. But what about when you're working with adults? And how does that work? And I think there's a lot of debate about it. And I downloaded a chapter of a book, or I've got a chapter of a book written by Andrew Reeves and Wendy Dryden. It's called Key Issues for Counselling in Action. They have a whole chapter on it. And it's a bit of a debate, Ken. And I think that from my own experience, there have been times where I have seen someone in the pit of despair and they just needed someone to connect with them. And I've leant over and I've just gently touched them, maybe on the hand or on the lower arm, just to say I'm there with them. But it would have taken a lot of thought, and I would have written it up in my notes, and I would have taken it to supervision.
Yeah.
And so nothing is in the shadows. And also, I have to take into account that I'm a man. I'm quite a big guy. For those of you who know me, I'm quite a broad guy. And if you're working with someone, you don't want someone like me hurtling themselves at you for a hug. I mean, it'd be like seeing a rugby player come at you. So again, it has to be, I think, negotiated. And there are sometimes, at the end of therapy where, clients have said, can I give you a hug? And I've said, of course. And they've instigated it. But I think that if and I read this on someone's Twitter feed the other day, if someone asks you for a hug and you've not thought it through, you're probably going to be in a bit of trouble.
Yeah. I like how you said, if somebody asks you for a hug. So you're in therapy and your client says, I could really do with a hug now. That is informed consent from that person that they're okay being touched. I think where it gets tricky is when we believe maybe that person could do with a hug. Maybe they don't want that. Maybe they don't want that intrusion. And I was watching a therapy session recently on YouTube. It was I think it's Diary of a CEO, where a person was speaking. And they were going through quite a difficult part of their life. And you could see the process that they were going through in that moment. And it felt broken for me. Now, this is just my opinion. This doesn't make it reality. This is just is it subjective or objective? I don't know which one it is, Rory, when it's my opinion. It is that the therapist stood up and said, I think you need a hug. Maybe they did.
Yeah.
Maybe they didn't. But there was, and maybe it was contracted beforehand, and which was out of my awareness. But it seemed to take the person out of the process. It seemed to be kind of wanting to lessen the hurt for this person. But I guess the other side of that is maybe it's a recognition of what that person has gone through, and that's why it becomes so difficult for me. As a neurodivergent person, I don't like touch unless it is invited, unless I know about it. And then the touch needs to be a certain way. It needs to be hard. It needs to be, I don't like very gentle touch. It's almost painful for me, gentle touch. So leaning over to me in a session and gently touching my arm would pull me completely out of where I was, and I would be 100% in the sensation that I was feeling in my body. So I think it's about your contract, working with the person beforehand. And I like how you said, Rory, when you find yourself in a situation where the person asks for a hug and you haven't gone through this process of thinking, that's when on the spot, don't I? Is it appropriate? Is it not appropriate? And of course, touch is two ways. It may be that the client stands up after the session and opens up their arms, inviting you in for a hug. What do you do? What do you do in that situation? Have you thought about it? Have you spoken to your supervisor about it? And I certainly did, because I find hugging and touch uncomfortable for me. I needed to take that to supervision and work on it and look at it. There's for me, hell is a family get together where everyone's going, oh, hello, and hugging one another and all the kisses. I just want to go and stand outside until all that's over, to be honest with you.
You'd be stood outside with me, Ken, because I don't like faux air kissing or all this kind of flowery touching where someone takes you by the shoulders and kisses the air either side of you. Maybe that's because I'm a working class man.
Going back to our last topic, tying it together. I like it.
There's my stereotypical prejudices being rolled out for everybody to hear. And yes, you're absolutely right. And I also think that we cannot dismiss transference in this, because if you're wanting to hug someone, if you don't know yourself well enough, and you think, oh, this client needs a hug, it might be that actually you're seeing a lot of your life experience being played out in the client's narrative. Yeah. And actually the hug isn't for them, it's for you. You're kind of hugging yourself. Bingo. Yeah. Absolutely. which is why I think, personal therapy can be useful in training to understand your own processes and to really do that work of personal development. It's interesting. Conversely, one of the things that was picked up when I was doing personal development was I'm not very tactile person. And what was that about? And how would that impact on clients? So I think we have to be very thoughtful. I'm going to leave you with one final observation, which I was thinking about this before we recorded the podcast. This was a question asked me when I went to do my placement about 20 years ago. And sitting next to me on my left was a therapist who'd come back to practice to get further qualifications. She was qualified. And she was adamant that holding the client's hand and being close to the client was really important. And on the right-hand side of me was someone who worked in Sports Direct. And they were saying that their policies and procedures were that you could only touch someone on the lower arm. And we were asked the question, would you touch your clients? And everybody had to give an answer. And the person on the left of me said, oh, yes, I would hold a client if they're upset. And the person on the right said, I would only touch them on the lower arm, but I wouldn't touch a female. That's what he said. I wouldn't touch a female. When it came to me, I just said, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. And I think that was probably I got the placement. I think that was probably the right answer. And I think it's still the same. I don't know. I don't know. I would have to think about it. And sometimes I may have asked the client in the past, is there anything you need from me here? And the client may say, I'd just like you to hold my hand. In which case, there's a contract right there. It's a verbal one.
Yes.
But there's a contract right there. It's such an interesting field, and it's so much part of psychological contact and being a therapist as opposed to just being a professional facade of a therapist. Fascinating.
I like the topic, and where am I at the end of this? We often say, Rory and I, we're not the experts. We're not telling you how it should be. We're just two peers having a discussion about topics that come up to contemporary issues. And for me, should you touch a client? No. And yes, it depends. It really does depend. But would I touch a client in the spur of the moment when something just came up in me? For me, no. It would be contemplated, thought about, taken to supervision.
Yeah.
But that's
Absolutely.
just me. That's just me. And we want to hear what your thoughts are on this. And the place to do that is our Facebook group. This is where these topics come from. Go onto Facebook, type in Counselling Tutor. Our administration team will let you in. Tens of thousands of counsellors, psychotherapists, tutors, students, all on this journey. And this is where we hang out and we have these conversations. So come and join in the conversation and suggest what topics you want to hear for practice today, the contemporary, what's happening now in counselling and psychotherapy. So there it is. And we now move on to Practice Matters. That's the CPD section of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. And today, a seasoned lecturer, it is Sally-Anne Armitage, speaking about a very, very important topic. And that is the management of risk, Rory.
Absolutely. Sally-Anne Armitage delivered a fantastic lecture on managing risk. She's one of our kind of viewers' favourites. She just has this magical way of getting information across. I caught up with her about managing risk, and this is what she had to say.
Practice Matters.
The National Counselling Society is proud to sponsor Practice Matters. National Counselling Society are really excited to have launched their Children and Young People Therapist Register for counsellors working with the younger age group. To find out more, visit nationalcounselingsociety.org. nationalcounselingsociety.org.
Assessing risk in a therapy room when you're working with a client who may be at risk of harming themselves or harming others is an essential skill for therapists. It's not one that's sometimes taught at first trainings, so people have to go and get some CPD on that. And I'm delighted to welcome back one of our fabulous lecturers, a regular lecturer with us, Sally-Anne Armitage, who has produced a lecture on managing risk. So Sally, welcome again.
Thank you. I feel like you need to have an applause there because you sort of get this welcome, come on in, like you're on telly. So risk lecture, and it was good. like we were talking about before the camera came on, it was tons and tons of people came to see it. So I wasn't particularly expecting that. So there is a need for people to find out about risk.
And just to give a little bit of context on this, we made this lecture as a open lecture that people could come and see. And for those people who came to the open lecture, there was a huge amount of attendance and a huge amount of positive feedback. But the lecture now sits in our CSR and CPD library. So is it, I won't say is it important, but can we underestimate the importance of understanding how to assess risk as therapists?
We can. And I think basically for the reasons you've just said, Rory, that it's not covered very well in a lot of trainings. And not only that, but through preparing the lecture, I found that I've got a ton of counselling books, that I've accumulated over years. And risk is not covered in any meaningful way in hardly any of them. So it's avoided quite universally as risk. And I know why. I sat down and started planning that lecture, and it's a rabbit hole. It's a very, very, sort of nuanced area is risk, but it's one that is necessary. It's one that it's necessary that we get our heads around, because we just don't know if that risk's going to come up in the work.
Absolutely. And when we talk about risk, what specifically are we referring to, Sally?
So, for the purpose of this lecture, I focused in on the client is in danger, the client themselves is in danger, or the client talks about somebody in their lives who might be in danger. So I honed right in on those two areas, which in my teaching experience have caused students and qualified through my supervisory work the most anxiety. So that's what I did. I honed right in on those, and I've tried to talk about it in a human way, rather than an academic way, because I think when we get in the room with a client, academia is no use to us.
No.
It's human to human interaction. It's authenticity, and it's the ability to communicate something that's a worry that might have come up in our minds, to be able to communicate it in the moment in a way that does not make the client want to leave, doesn't want the client want to get angry, that actually communicates how we're feeling and owns it. I'm a little bit concerned about something you've just said. I'm going to talk to you about this without judgment, but this is what's going on for me. Those types of conversations that can be really difficult.
What are the dangers if a therapist just decides not to go down that route of inquiry when risk is mentioned? Someone thinking of self-harming or taking their own life. It might be an obvious question, but what are the kind of dangers that lurk from a therapist not being attentive to that particular area?
Yeah, and I think it's good to explicitly say this. So the dangers are that your client could take their own life. If we're not diligent around risk, that is ultimately one of the fears, isn't it, that they decide to go ahead and complete suicide. And during the lecture, I talk about risk factors and how risk is a sliding scale. It's very, very rare that it's definitely risk, act now, there is a problem right now. I've had that probably 2 or 3 times in my 12 years counselling career. It's very rare. More often than that, it's in between there. It's in between high risk, no risk, and it's somewhere in between there. And I talk in the lecture about how different factors can inform where it is on that risk scale, if you like. And I think that's a really useful thing, that it's a holistic view. It's not just yes, there is, no, there isn't.
Yes, and I think it lives within the dialogue, doesn't it, between yourself and the client. One of the things that really struck me was one of the questions that was asked was, are there any positive aspects to somebody talking about risky behaviour? And you outlined quite a few positive aspects of someone, maybe thinking of completing suicide, in terms of them voicing it. What are those positive aspects?
Just think about it in the simplest possible way, that somebody feels at ease to talk to you about it. How wonderful You know, how wonderful that a client feels like that may have been totally kept to themselves, or maybe themselves and the Samaritans, or maybe a couple of good friends. They're able to talk to you about it. And, you know, one of the things that I mentioned in my lecture is that talking about suicide never makes it more likely to happen, or the research suggests it doesn't.
Yes.
So talking about it either makes no difference to the risk, or it starts to reduce the risk, which I think is a bit of maybe something that does go around sometimes in the counselling world. Like, if I raise it, do I somehow make it more possible?
Yes. I mean, the answer is no. I'm agreeing with you.
Yeah, please do. And you know, I speak as well about how I've got some initial questions that I ask in the first session. And in a very conversational, very nurturing way, I ask these questions. But it's a matter of finding out, being really really transparent about risk. You know, have you ever... I asked the question in a roundabout way, have you ever harmed yourself or thought seriously about it?
Yeah.
You know, just, this is the space to talk about that stuff. It's all right.
Okay. Absolutely. And some therapists may use intake forms, PHQ-9, GAD-7, that type of thing. And some of those forms actually do highlight if there's any risk. You know, I know a lot of student therapists use forms, and sometimes a bit of confusion regarding what are the forms for. There's a lot of thought about it's probably just for funders, it's probably just for tick boxing for agencies, but actually the forms have a specific function. And if someone's taught to understand and interpret the data on the forms, and very quickly, you know, you hand the form to the client fills them in, you take them out, you look at them, and then from then you should be able to get a really clear snapshot of where the client is at that period of time. And if there is any risk, then you could start looking at the risk and working with the client.
Yeah, and those forms are a very quick way to get to that information that doesn't require the client to somehow create sentences and create the words to describe how much things have been difficult for them. And also it's about couching it, isn't it? You're not like, so I'm going to start with this questionnaire, so I want you to take your time with this. You know, it's quite an important document. You know, you're not doing that. You're not like, whoa, hang on a minute, this is that. You know, you say, please don't overthink this. It's really just to give me a real snapshot. You know, don't worry too much about it. It's only me that's going to see it, and just be really transparent about it. We might come back to it, we might not. We'll see how we go. You know what I mean? Just being really conversational and introducing it in a way that doesn't make it seem like some questionnaires that may have been answered in the past, you know, that had that sort of, this is significant, I don't know what's going to happen with this feeling.
Yeah,
you know?
You're not buying a house or a car. You know, it's not like looking through a contract, is it? It is just have a look at that. Just go with what you feel it in. Or for those who don't use intake questionnaires, like you say, just ask the question, you know, have you self-harmed? You know, have you felt like you might want to take your own life? And I think that's interesting or I should say important to outline at the beginning of a new engagement. You talked about some, I don't think we can talk about risk without talking about some of the urban legends that surround risk. So you've hit on one, which is if you talk about suicide, then if you talk about suicide to a client, they're more likely to instigate taking their own life. Are there any other urban myths out there about life taking? I'm thinking about those people who talk about taking their own life, never do it.
Yes, yeah, and it's difficult because I do speak in the lecture about this, how there are clients that do speak about it frequently, and personally, just honestly, I can become quite desensitized to that. Yeah, this is just what that client does. You know, I don't want to sound unempathic. I'm a very empathic person. You'd hope so, wouldn't you, with the lecture I did a bit back. But I think it's about every so often checking in with it and making sure there isn't more going on in the background. Is it changing? Are we pretty much the same as we were, when we last talked about this? Is it worsening, and checking in with it and trying not to just get like, oh yeah, this is just what you talk about. And I'm thinking about urban legends, Rory. Another one is that people who self-harm are suicidal, and that's not true.
No.
It's statistically the people who self-harm are more likely to complete suicide, but people who self-harm are not always suicidal. I think that's really important.
Yes.
It's like anything, isn't it? It can be a bit of a gateway to doing more self-damage. It can be like a stepstone to that eventual risk of suicide and completing suicide. It's like drinking, isn't it? Without that first drink, you wouldn't have had more and more and more, and then eventually, fall into addiction. So that's why it can be a little bit of a shift on that risk scale. Like there might be a little bit more risk if the person currently self-harms, but we're not sort of jumping to conclusions. No.
And I think one of the things is about testing the plan, isn't it? And I've certainly said to clients in the past, how are you going to do it? And I've told students, they've been appalled. You're going to ask someone how they're going to take their own life. And I'd say, well, yes, because that then gives me an idea of if there is a plan in place. And if someone says, well, I've not really thought about it, then the risk is lower because they've not got to the stage of planning. It's not gone away, but it's not as clear. If someone says, I'm going to take my life in ways A, B, or C, and I've got the implements or the plan to do it, that becomes a lot more pressing, and there's a lot more risk, isn't there, Sally?
Definitely. And we need to think about that, like thinking about, I don't want to be here, I wish it was all over. Think about the journey between that and actually going down the DIY store and picking up some bits that you might need.
Yeah.
Think about how different that is in terms of intentionality. I think that's a real journey. So I think if somebody goes to that point where they're like, I'm going to book a day off, I might not do it, but I'm going to book that day off, that puts it more into the realm of possibility.
Yes. And also things like if someone's actually attempted to take their life before, because that then again increases the risk. I don't think we could finish this conversation off without talking about working with younger people. This question was asked when you actually gave this lecture, and you deferred to me because I was a child therapist for 7 years, and you did work with children. Yeah.
And I don't make up when I don't know something. I'll say I don't know it.
Yeah, well, that's fair enough. And I think for colleagues who are child therapists, one of the things that I've observed through I was a child therapist for 7 years. I worked in a school and I had quite a busy clinic there. And one of the things I learned about working with children through the work and also through the training that I did, because I did train as a child and adolescent therapist, is that children's risk profiles tend to be higher. They tend to engage in more risky behaviour. Boys tend to engage in more risky behaviour than girls. No letters in the postbag. That's a general observation, and I think is well documented in in research. And I also think that you need to make sure that if you're working with young people, certainly within an organisation, that you understand the safeguarding policies of the school. And in my view would be that if a child's in that position and they've got a clear plan, you definitely need to disclose. Even if they haven't got a clear plan, you need to think about what support you can put in for the child. It's not the same with adults. And in my view, and it might be controversial, the Caldecott principles of confidentiality, when it comes to risk in children, I don't think should be applied as stringently as maybe other behaviours that children do, where you would automatically give them confidentiality. I'm thinking about intimate relationships and that type of thing, consensual intimate relationships. So it's an interesting area, as you rightly say, Sally. One that's not really taught in first trainings, and we're very grateful that you've produced this lecture. It was very well thought of. can I just say, for those who might want to watch this lecture, and why wouldn't people want to watch a lecture of something so important? Come on.
Free lecture, come on.
Well, yeah, what would you hope that people took away from the lecture?
I'm hoping to get rid of some of the fog. I think what I've experienced myself, honestly, early on in my practice, and I see through people, is they just don't think about it. Hopefully it won't come up, because if it did, I'd just, I wouldn't know where to start, really, because they've not particularly had very concrete guidance, and it is an area of nuance. So hopefully they watch this lecture and leave, and this is what's been happening. I've been getting quite a few emails. Hopefully you leave this lecture feeling a little bit more robust and confident when it comes to how you'd actually tangibly handle risk in the moment with a client. That's what I'm hoping.
Well, I mean, I think you can't get a better summary than that, Sally. Working with risk is now available in the CSR, the student library, and also the CPD library for our qualified colleagues. And it just remains for me to say, Sally-Anne Armitage, lecturer extraordinaire, thank you for joining us.
Massive thank you to Sally-Anne. Massive thank you to you, Rory. You're the one out there making the connections, having these discussions, and bringing us the experts who know. So grateful. And of course, if you enjoyed what Sally-Anne said, you want to delve a little deeper or dive a little deeper, her lecture has been added to the Counsellor CPD library. If you're a qualified practitioner, for less than the price of a cup of coffee a month, you can have access to all of our CPD lectures bought by the experts. And if you're a student, we've also added this lecture to the Counselling Study resource as well, which is the library for students. And if you want to find out more about that, if you're not a member, go to counsellingtutor.com. All the information's right there on the home page. Rory, this has been episode 258 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast.
Yes, we started off with theory and practice, psychological contact. What is it? And more to the point, what are the barriers to it? We moved into practice today, and we touched on the subject of touching therapy, and what we have to think about, what we have to consider, and also thinking about our own motivations. And then finally, in Practice Matters, I caught up with Sally-Anne Armitage talking about managing risk in therapy. And as always, stay grounded and stay safe.
If you're a qualified counsellor or psychotherapist, then why not check out the Counsellor CPD Library? Stay current with your CPD requirements with over 150 hours of academically rigorous, on-demand lectures you can stream to your device. Joining Counsellor CPD will expand your skill set to create a more specialised, highly rewarding practice. For more information on the Counselor CPD Library, visit counsellingtutor.com.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode on our website at www.counsellingtutor.com.